Hello everyone, I'm Claire. I'm the SCF Marketing and Campaigns Director. Welcome to our SCF Market Analysis webinar. Just to give you some context, the reason we're doing this webinar is because we released our annual SCF Market Forecast Report last week. You can get that free to download on our website at the moment. And we have the author of the report here today, Gabriel. And our Chief Strategy Officer, Fletcher, who I'll hand over to next.
Thank you, Claire, and it's a pleasure to welcome you, Caroline, again to our annual get-together to look at your market research. This session was very popular last year, so we're running it again this year. The format, everyone, just so you're aware, we've got a few, Caroline's prepared a few slides just to take us through some of the highlights of the report. We will, as usual, aim to take some questions from the audience in the last 10 minutes. So I'll keep my eye on the clock and make sure that we allow ourselves a little bit of time at the end for questions from the audience. And you will see on the Zoom platform there's a Q&A tab which you can fill in with your questions, and they'll be filtered through to me and Caroline towards the end of the session. So let's press on, Caroline, and let's get rolling on your thoughts from this year's report. Any initial thoughts before we get into the details? That you just general messages from your impressions at this stage?
Yes, thanks, Simon. Thanks to everyone for joining, and it's always a great pleasure to work on this forecast and operator survey. I think maybe it's about 15 years now that I've been working with the forum on this, so we've seen the thrills and spills of the small cell market together, that's for sure. Generally, I think, Simon, especially when you sort of think back perhaps a year ago, there's still quite a heavy dose of caution in our industry for reasons I'm sure we'll get into, but also quite significant added level of sort of looking forward, looking beyond current difficulties at what might come in future. So I think there's a bit of optimism. People are starting to talk about investing quite significantly in some next generation of technologies, whereas last year I think the message was very much let's hold back, let's wait and see. But having said that, with a big dose of realism attached to any investment, need to be very sure of what the returns and the monetization is going to be. So there's a cautious mood, and I think that is starting to kind of actually in some ways drive the ecosystem forward. There's a sense of urgency that there are things that we know help with accelerating small cell rollout, such as shared networks, neutral host models, and so on. I sense a real determination to get down to real plans, practical ways to make these things happen rather than just discuss. So that would be my sort of very high level sense of what the
reality check. Got it. Okay. Is there anything you would just say? I think it's useful, actually quite good in the report. You talk about the methodologies. We're useful, just maybe a few words on that, on how you do this market research. Is quite an asset that's built up over the years, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. We sometimes don't explain enough about it. You're right, we talk about our figures, but this goes for a lot of forecasting. People quite legitimately say, well, where on earth did that come from? In the case of the forum, we have a unique proprietary forecast model and methodology that's been built up over many years, as we said, and with input from quite a lot of active members. And there are a lot of inputs to that in terms of what shapes the assumptions that we're making. Lots of conversations and tracking of industry trends. But the key input really is our annual survey of small cell deployers. In the early days, that was only a survey of mobile operators. Now, as the deployment models have expanded, so has the survey base. So this year, 107 organisations responded to a survey where we ask about what are your deployment intentions, what are your commercial drivers, what's holding you back, if you're what barriers are there to you executing on your plans. What are your sort of timescales and technology choices, and of course your spending budgets, and so on. But we had a good mix of respondents, about 70 operators, mobile or fixed mobile, and all these are. It's a very global survey, as you'll see from the results. But also we had 23 private network operators. And we had 13 neutral host organisations, which spanned from towercos to very specialised small cell centric neutral hosts, and it's a very rigorous survey. All the members of the risk panel they've all opted in. Most of them have worked with us for years. We can see how their sort of thoughts change year to year. It's a very consistent panel, and all the companies that take part, they have to be actively deploying small cell networks or planning to do so within the next year to two in at least one country and one environment. So these are people who are making real plans. They're not just thinking speculatively.
Interesting. Okay, great. So let's without further ado, let's start digging into some of the thoughts that are coming out of the report then.
Yes. I suppose just as a first headline, it's good to show the top level forecast. So these are annual deployments. It's a deployments forecast for people who haven't looked at it before. So these are units deployed commercially, and the base unit that we count is a radio unit. That's so that in a virtualized system where there might be multiple radio units attached to one baseband, we're counting each radio unit to get a sense of scale. So here you can see our top level, which is showing that between 2022 and 2030, and worth saying that this year we extended the forecast from 2028 to 2030, where we're starting to see some beginnings of visibility that far away. So in that period, we're seeing deployments growing at a compound annual growth rate of 8.6% in unit terms. That all adds up to cumulative shipments in the period of about 66 million units. And that results in an installed base by the end of this period of about 52 million. Obviously, as networks mature, some of those deployments are replacements or upgrades. And you particularly see that upgrade figure obviously being aligned with migration from 4G to 5G, particularly standalone, which I think we'll come on to later as a trend. You can see that up to 2028, the CAGR would be higher. The deployments peak in 2028. Peak for now. Obviously, we're not looking beyond 2030. We can assume there'll be more peaks ahead. But 9.5 million in that year, which is coming up for twice the figure of 2022. So while we have pulled back the forecast a little bit compared to 2023, and in 2023 we pulled it back quite significantly compared to 2022 because of global macro forecasts, and we've all seen the decline in current telecom capex and so on. So lots of factors in that. So we pulled it back in the early years by about sort of 12% up to 2025, but then we do see it catching up. So it's cautious, but with, as we said in the opening remarks, a level of optimism as well.
Yeah, I think that because the actually when we did the millimeter wave paper, it was just published a couple of months ago. We had this. You did a refresh on the numbers. So I remember that just
That's
to get
right, yes.
Slightly lower to the forecast. So it is with these. I think a few years ago, there was always a joke about looking for that hockey stick, but we're just not realistically looking for a sensible amount of growth each year, aren't we? In this market, it's not going to be a huge hockey stick forecast that we're expecting. What, you mentioned 2028. I'm just looking at that. I'm wondering why. I mean, I guess you're talking to buyers, so they might be a little bit conservative compared to the guys making the kit who always want to
Yes.
hype up their view. But what are you attributing that 2028 flatlining into 29 and or sort of slightly dipping in the volumes? Is there anything that you're picking up there that's making that the case?
A lot of it's just the normal cycle of generations. We're still in a generational cycle, as you know, in mobile networks. And so I think the buyers at the minute are assuming that they will build out what they're planning to build for, particularly for 5G small cells, quite substantially over the next sort of 4 years. And then they'll take a break while they wait to see what the next generation of technology brings. It may be 6G, whatever that is, or it may just be a next iteration. So I think it's obviously 2030 is an artificial cutoff. If we could look further in our crystal balls, it would come down a little bit more and then it would go up again. Almost.
I mean, realistically, you're not going to see. I mean, buyers are not going to be looking that far ahead. But I mean, it's good to get that.
No.
And that sense that, as you say, there's a phase of investment, and then they're aware of something called 6G that may or may not emerge, and perhaps that's why they're just holding a little bit. Okay.
And although you're right that they don't look as far in detail as far as 2030, what they do is work out how long is the window to deploy what they think they need to deploy now. So if they say it's 5 years, and most of them, the consensus is it's sort of a 5-year process, and then you take a rest. That sort of is where they can indicate where their particular 5 years would be, and they're very heavily weighted to this middle years of the.
So still seeing as at the SCWS this year, Caroline, you were saying that it's always important to think of small cell more of an enterprise investment related cycle. Forget the 10-year cycle. Think about 5-year. Still very much the case in terms of the patents and the conversations you're having with the deployers. Yeah, they think in those sorts of time frames.
Very much so, particularly the ones who are deploying for enterprise certainly are, and I think we've talked about it before, Simon. It is a challenge for parts of our ecosystem to get used to that very different rhythm compared to MNOs. The advantage, of course, they decide things more quickly, because if you're thinking of a 5-year plan rather than a 10-year plan, you can't spend 3 years on the RFP and choosing the supplier. So things happen more quickly, but you have to be able to respond to that for sure.
Yeah, and one last question before we move on to the next slide. One of the things that came out in the report when I was looking at it over the last couple of days is the commentary about networks. So less about individual units, but more about deploying of networks and features that may be required at that network level, and perhaps a sense that there were some features in 4G small cell networks that hadn't quite made the translation into the 5G space that perhaps the industry was anticipating, or maybe the industry dropped the ball on that one, not sure. But that's an interesting piece that you've picked out there, an interesting issue. Potentially.
Yes, I agree. I do think in the sort of 4G phase, which of course isn't over, but when 5G hadn't really arrived, the industry was quite successful in moving from small cells being largely a spot solution, as you say, and you stick one into to address a coverage gap or a capacity hotspot. But there wasn't really much need to think about them as a system. And then lots of work was done, including by the forum, of course, on allowing them to scale up much more and behave as an integrated network with all the software and so on that goes with that. I think at the beginning of 5G, yes, some of it didn't directly translate just because the technologies and standards had changed, but also because inevitably the ecosystem swung off in terms of their development priorities towards the big networks and solved some of those problems. And then as the operators, particularly in the outdoor environment, started to densify again, so then the R&D swung back, and we're starting to fill the gaps, but it hasn't quite caught up. And I think it's one of the challenges of the small cell industry is that, as we'll see, the big engine is the enterprise, but most of the supplier ecosystem remains traditionally focused on operators, and so they are inclined to prioritize the sort of things that the operators are thinking about, and sometimes forget that enterprises are looking for networks, not for just occasional access points, and they're very used to building networks of different technologies.
Good, subtle point. Okay, let's move on to the start to look at a little bit more details.
Yeah, so we've talked a bit about what the survey and the model are, and I thought before we go on with with some more of the detailed sort of forecast predictions, it was worth pausing to focus a little bit more on the survey and how that works, because it is such a key input, and it's unique. So this is different to other forecasts in terms of the assumptions it's making and how those are driven, because, as you say, it's primarily a buyer-driven, demand-driven forecast rather than a vendor forecast. So this is just an example of the sort of questions that are asked in the survey, and we're actually planning to publish a more detailed report in a couple of months, looking at more of the details of the survey responses, because of course they don't all get published in the forecast report. But these are the sort of things that might be asked, and this was a question about intentions to invest in small cells within 3 years, and if so, what specific use cases would they be looking at? So there's a whole list of technologies here where at least some of the respondents feel that investing in small cell solutions is going to help them to implement things like 5G standalone, virtualized RAN, 5G advanced RAN AI, convergence with edge, urban density, and millimeter wave. All of these are seen as, important technologies, use cases to support various monetization options. But the important thing about this is that these are being seen by this particular cohort as being enabled, enhanced, or initially driven by small cells rather than the big networks.
And noticing most noticeable is the AI.
Yes.
Well, I know there's a degree of cynicism about that. I think everyone at MWC this year claimed to be having an AI solution, but is that are you sensing that's a little bit of the buyers buying into the hype, or do they actually see some real cases there where they think they need to increase their their interest in AI in conjunction with small cell?
Yeah, I think it's a mix. I think there is a huge amount of hype, and you can see how the yellow bars are last year's response to the same survey, so you can see the change. And most of them, as you say, haven't changed dramatically. There's an increased interest in 5G standalone to get into enterprise networks. That's and also 5G advanced for enterprise. But the really big one, as you say, is the RAN AI. So I think there's a lot of response to hype here, and even in completely anonymized surveys like ours, people still respond to hype. They still want to say that they're doing whatever is the latest thing. A couple of years ago it was metaverse, now it's AI. But behind all that, and when you probe, and we do some quite in-depth surveys on things like AI in the RAN, behind that there definitely are some significant areas of interest for how AI could transform the economics of a RAN, and this is most obvious to companies in small cells, partly because it should be slightly easier to implement in a small network than a macro, but also because there are just so many small cells. We've always talked about how the need for automation is much bigger in a small cell network because of all the moving parts. So lots of interest in sort of zero touch and automation, and can AI genuinely help with that? But perhaps there's an excitement about AI solving all the problems, whereas in fact it would probably just be part of the toolbox.
But of course, intuitively, it does feel like, you know, the complexity of the networks, again, coming back to that theme around networks rather than individual base station boxes. You know, there certainly has been some interesting innovation around thinking about how to simplify things and use AI to reduce complexity. So yeah, maybe the guys and girls who are buying are starting to believe that there are some features there that can bring some value. I mean, cynics may say it's the, you know, self-organizing networks 2.0, I guess, from a few years ago, but maybe, you know, with a bit more bells and whistles and a bit more capability. Yeah, it's an interesting one. And the one last thing before we move on from this slide that I'm quite interested in is this immersive metaverse thing, which has dropped down. I know there was quite a bit of enthusiasm, especially in cities, and you know, talking about metaverse-like and immersive experiences. So clearly something is happening in terms of the dropping of expectations there from one year to the next. Did you get any insights on what was the... Is it to do with the devices, the headsets, or what could be the issue there that's making people not believe that immersive is such a big thing these days?
Yes, I mean, again, it is partly the reverse of the RAN AI, that it was hugely overhyped, and then people sort of calmed down a bit about really how important it was. But we deliberately didn't, you know, we said immersive, not metaverse, so it wasn't too hypey, but even so, people understand that. I think on the consumer side, the devices certainly is the issue, but this is a very heavily enterprise centric survey. So I think that's not so much the issue, because there does seem to be quite a lot of development of kind of AR, VR sort of devices for industrial and enterprise use cases. I think it's not so much that they can't see the applications, but that the deployers don't know how to monetize them effectively yet, and how much extra money you get once you've built a very highly capable small cell network, how much sort of extra effort and extra reward is there in making it truly immersive capable. So if we did an enterprise survey, they might be quite different. They might be keeping their interest in immersive and sort of, but saying they can probably do it with the small cell networks they're implementing anyway, without a need for anything special on top.
Okay, good. All right, let's move on. And I've seen that there's some questions emerging, but I will pick out the question on this one whilst we're going through. So just talk through this one, Caroline, and then I'll bring in a question from the audience on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is breaking down that forecast figure on the left by the three main deployment environments that we always look at. So that's enterprise, primarily indoors, urban, primarily outdoors, not entirely, but and rural and remote. And then on the right by the main regions. And you can see at a glance that small cell deployments are dominated by the enterprise networks. They always have been since we started looking at this forecast. And to be honest, the percentages don't change a huge amount year to year. It's one very stable factor of our forecast. So they throughout this period, they were counting for about 2/3 total rollout. The percentage declines a little bit. It goes from almost 70 to sort of 65 over the period, as the urban and rural, the public small cells start to get some confidence and some new momentum. That sort of drive behind public small cells towards the end of the period does mean that in the end they get a higher compound annual growth rate, about 10% in urban environments, whereas in enterprise it's more like 7.8, but you've still got cumulatively a much bigger base in the enterprise areas. And looking at the regions, one big sort of milestone, I guess, is that by 2027 there'll be 5 regions that have achieved deployments of over 1 million units. And the last to hit that milestone in 27 is Western Europe, which has had various barriers. The ones that will get there earlier are North America, Greater China, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. It's worth saying that APAC's always the huge driver regionally of densification, and we split it between South Asia, mainly India, and Southeast Asia, obviously Japan, Korea, Singapore, and so on.
Yeah. So just one question I've spotted whilst we've got a display that's got countries mentioned. A question from the audience from the 107 respondents. Are there any from the US, or mostly Europe, or are they sort of well globally distributed, these buyers that you're surveying?
They're fairly global. The report to people download has the regional breakdown of the respondents, but there are quite a lot from North America, and the largest single group is from Asia, if you put all of Asia together, closely followed by Europe, and then North America, but we do have representation from the more emerging markets, and quite a lot actually in Middle East and North Africa. So it's a mix, but we do sort of try to represent the regions as far as we can, and we do get more enthusiastic take up in certain regions where there's more experience, more people who are ready to share their plans. And North America is probably the most responsive region in terms of people being very eager to take part, but their total number of deployers is obviously somewhat lower, particularly on the operator side, than in, say, Western Europe.
Yeah, the other relatively small slither on the countries or regions is Middle East. Quite interesting to see how that grows. We've got within the forum, we see much more interest from the Middle East region in thinking about how small cells can help them in their network. So I wonder if that's something that may uptick over a little period of time as these forecasts get refreshed.
Yes,
because they're relatively low there, isn't it, compared to a lot? I mean, obviously the market is relatively small and quite less densely packed, possibly population areas where capacity is needed, but there's still enterprise network needs, you would have thought. So perhaps that will grow over time.
Yes, I think it will. I mean, obviously, as you say, Middle East is quite a small region. We see, like you, I certainly see a lot of activity in Middle East. I know you and I have both been to small cell sort of events in UAE and such places. I was in Saudi a while ago, and there was a lot of activity. I think, in a way, we probably get a slightly exaggerated view of activity in the Middle East because of these huge city developments, and I think those are what often drive small cells. They're extremely large and well thought out, and they have good neutral host models starting to come together to support smart cities. But it's easy to forget that outside of those great cities of the Gulf, there's also huge swathes of the Middle East that don't have much infrastructure at all. We can look at some of the country, and obviously some of it very politically unstable. Yeah. So therefore not a great basis for investment in infrastructure. So I think it's a real mix. And although they have a lot of industry, some of the countries with the most money are trying to diversify their industry, but still remain a fairly limited number of industries compared to say parts of Europe, so perhaps a relatively limited base of customers at this stage, but we can see those economies changing, and I'm sure small cells will be driven with that.
Let's move on then to look at the old favourite of barriers.
Yes, it always seems perhaps it's a bit negative to dwell as much as we do on.
It's an important topic for.
But yes, no, exactly, because in the end, I think we've always acknowledged that almost the reasons to do small cells are almost self-evident, and people agree on them, and there's not a great deal of controversy. So what stops them being built absolutely everywhere is barriers that obviously in many circumstances outweigh those drivers. So every year, as you say, Simon, we look in a lot of detail at the forum at what is stopping things, what's slowing things down. We ask the survey respondents, not just what are their barriers, but how far are those barriers delaying them? So we tend to ask them, what would be your ideal year to kick off your at-scale deployment? What's your actual year going to be? In other words, how much further away is it? And would you even bring it forward ahead of your ideal year if conditions were great? So in other words, if barriers came down more quickly, would that encourage you to be even more aggressive? So we get a really good sense of exactly not just what the barriers are, but what the impact is in terms of the timing to deploy at scale. And you can see that impact just at a high level in the graph on the left. Obviously, when you forecast, as people understand, no one actually has a crystal ball, so there isn't just a number. We do best and worst case forecasting and based on any reasonable scenario. And the main factors that make the variation for ours are indeed how quickly the key barriers will be addressed, to the extent that we believe that deployers will bring forward their deployments in the best case, or delay them further in the worst case. So rather oversimplifying it, but that's where this is coming from. And you can see it's quite a dramatic variation. So in terms of cumulative deployments in the period we're looking at, there's a gap between best and worst of about 8.3 million units, which is a considerable revenue for vendors and amount of capacity for the people that want to use it. What's of course additionally challenging about looking at barriers is they're not the same for everybody, and they change. So if you looked at our survey of 8-9 years ago, they weren't exactly the same barriers that people are talking about now. So the ecosystem, the industry are constantly having to look at this and work out which are the new priorities. So the ones on the right are the ones cited by the MNOs, and we'll look at the barriers for the other two main deployer groups shortly. But in terms of MNOs, well, you can see that they're fairly evenly spread between, these are the top 6 that were cited. And most of them are economic, so total cost of ownership, and particularly of the underlying infrastructure, the sites and so on. Lack of clear monetization models. How scalable is it, particularly in enterprise where there may be many different use cases with different network requirements? Mobile operators are used to building one big network that can support anything, and now they're looking at perhaps much more specialized requirements. It needs a shared risk and investment model that hasn't been clearly defined, and so on.
Yeah. So there's quite a lot of financial barriers there. The 3 of the top 4 are financially oriented narrative, aren't they? Okay, let's move on then to look at the diversity of deployers and barriers. So this is starting to move outside the MNO and into the other guys who are deploying.
Exactly, and we talk a lot in the forum, quite rightly, about what will really make this market gain scale and accelerate is having different deployment models. So we said that the sort of MNO model doesn't necessarily work well in all enterprise scenarios, either for the enterprise or for the MNO themselves. So we need lots of deployers, but they do have different barriers. And as we said, that's obviously a challenge. The industry has got to try and address lots of different barriers in different scenarios, which is difficult. It makes a body like the forum very important because they can sort of bring together some of the shared learnings and come up with kind of frameworks. But it's challenging. So the other 2 main groups that we look at are the neutral hosts, so their barriers are on the left, and the private network operators. All that includes actually enterprises deploying for themselves, and also operators, as in telecom operators, who have a separate private network operation. So all that's included in P&O, just for information. But you can see for the neutral hosts, again, the scalability is very important. How do they adapt themselves for perhaps diverse requirements when a lot of their business model relates to scale? monetization issues, of course, site issues, and for them, complex stakeholder relationships, having to build relations with all kinds of different companies. It might be landlords, it might be enterprises and different service providers, and make that work in a business sense. And also, in some cases, lack of MNO support. Neutral hosts usually need an MNO to be their anchor customer, especially in an urban environment. And then private network operators, well, these are quite different. And this is interesting because they relate to enterprise concerns. So operational complexity, how does it work with what they already have, such as Wi-Fi? Do they have spectrum? And again, in large enterprises will probably want some kind of hybrid private-public system. So again, you need MNO cooperation with this, and that varies in different markets.
Yes, and that is very interesting. So the two areas that I've picked up in the forum conversations that are starting to gain. I mean, the first one, I guess, is the JOTS story in the UK, which provides a framework and maybe helps to address some of the questions around the support of the operators and financing models, because you've got sort of like a blueprint, as you said, that allows you to repeat a trusted deployment model. Hopefully,
Yes.
that should address some of the barriers between the neutral host and the public operator. But yeah, the enterprise area is quite interesting, isn't it? In that
Yes.
there's that relationship with Wi-Fi comes up there. And do you think there's a trend now around the private network spectrum and talk around sharing of spectrum that, for me, feels like it may start to address that lack of spectrum barrier question that's coming up in the P&O and seems to be always a bit of a concern, but that may help to unlock that a little bit as a possible way forward to lower that barrier.
I think it does, and already that lack of spectrum barrier is less prominent in this survey than it was last year, for instance, for the reasons you say. I think it's, I sort of said earlier that we still have the challenge of an industry that is its assumptions are very driven by the telecom market, and the enterprises are quite different. And I think this is it's a good example. Enterprises don't understand spectrum issues because they use Wi-Fi, and Wi-Fi lives in unlicensed spectrum, of course. So they don't really, it's the same as the complexity of sort of deploying and operating. It's not enough to sort of reduce it slightly. It's got to be as good as Wi-Fi, because that's something the enterprises have, in most cases, have dealt with for many years, and they really are baffled by why cellular is different. We know why it's different, but they don't. So these sort of private network operator has all that to deal with, as well as
that conceptual issue on the complexity is there. I mean, it's unnecessarily so, in my view. I mean, I think we seem to overcomplicate things, but I definitely think that as soon as you start to open up that Pandora's box on spectrum, then some enterprise buyers start to say, "We'll stick with Wi-Fi, thank you very much."
Absolutely. Whereas, as you say, if there is more shared or flexible spectrum, as there is as we know, in a growing number of markets, and you can see the impact. I mean, CBRS obviously is the one most talked about in the United States, but seeing it in the UK, Japan, Germany, lots of different models maybe, but you can see how that just opens up for all kinds of companies to innovate in terms of how they deploy and run networks, and you're not so sort of stuck with just a certain community who are used to deploying in licensed spectrum.
So let's move on to the next one. So conscious we've got 10 minutes or so to go on these slides, but this one is always one that I'd like to look at, is this: how do we do the deployment and the model? And it's quite always interesting to see the division and the types of operator type that you're classifying people into in this graph is and the heavy MVNO versus P&O and etc. The definitions are always interesting. So any key points on this one?
Yes, I mean, this breaks down those three big buckets that we saw before. Well, no, it breaks down two actually, because this is enterprise, so we haven't got the public M&Os included in this particular breakdown. But as I said, we do have the P&O division of telco, which is the orange band, which you can see is quite substantial, although less so than the pure play P&O, so P&O that's not part of a telco. And those throughout the period, those are the biggest deployers, the single biggest group of deployers in terms of the numbers of units that we expect them to deploy. But yes, we're also seeing direct deployment by enterprises themselves, obviously usually very large ones. That's declining. There are a few big enterprise sort of projects in the middle of the decade, but generally enterprises look to outsiders to help. There are system integrators who specialise in particular verticals, and especially in the very large scale deployments, like very big factories, for instance. You'd expect an SI of expertise in that vertical to be there. The neutral host we mentioned, and the heavy MVNO is mainly an MVNO, but will build out some specific equipment of their own that they will run, which typically would be perhaps a little private or enterprise network hanging on to a public network where they have an MVNO, so that they can provide the sort of coverage and roaming. And then of course there's vendors. I mean, the big equipment vendors are a rising force in this. You can see them near the top, often providing sort of cloud-based systems, and the hyperscalers are in for these purposes are included in that category.
Yes, very interesting. And the gradual growth continuing of the neutral host as a percentage, and that line is tracking up over the next few years, which is
more and more important, definitely.
Yeah.
And then outdoors in the public network, of course, much more M&O driven. But we do also see the increase in importance of neutral host outside. We haven't got the graph on these slides, but you'll see it in the report. They only deployed about 8% of small cells in 2022, but we expect that to go up to, say, about 28% by the end of this decade.
It's very interesting. Okay, let's just think about the next couple of slides then, as we come towards the end.
Yeah, so looking more at technology now, I suppose we've mainly talked about deployment options and timescales and so on so far. But of course, the other always moving target is just the architectures that deployers can choose from, and trying to align those to the commercial models that they have. So this one, it's the same forecast, of course, but broken down this time by the main architecture that's chosen. There's a lot of different variations on this in the report, that you can see lots of sort of subsets of these big categories that you see here. On the left is enterprise, on the right is urban. And we're really looking at, well, what's the growth in the sort of new architectures, by which we mean the disaggregated RAN. So the all-in-one small cells are obviously the traditional integrated ones. 2-unit is where the radio unit is separated from the baseband. The baseband may be virtualized, but it doesn't have to be. It may be what we call a cluster, which is just like a shared baseband between multiple radio units. And the 3-unit is most commonly associated with the Open RAN model, but not always. And that's where you split the baseband into a centralized unit and into a more distributed unit that handles real-time functions. And then, of course, there's the persistence of the the very established architecture of distributed antenna system, and we only actually look at the active DAS in this particular forecast.
I mean, and it's noticeable, isn't it, Caroline? I mean, you've got that 3-unit by 2030 is a fair old chunk of the bar.
Yeah.
Across both, and you said that's not always Open RAN compliance necessarily, but we're converging towards an Open RAN compliant ecosystem in the small cell. In these conversations you're having with the deployers, they're welcoming Open RAN as a framework to help with with their networks.
Cautiously, I would say. I think it depends on the definitions of Open RAN, and we go into that quite a lot in the survey. If you were just talking about an open front hall interface so that you can mix and match these various elements, then an Open RAN is definitely very much very important for multi-vendor choices and flexibility. Doesn't necessarily have to be the ORAN interface. Obviously, there are different choices, including small cell forums, the interfaces that small cell forum support. So, so there's choices there, and none of that has to be anything to do with virtualized RAN. Whereas, of course, the full ORAN architecture is very heavily aligned to a vRAN, which I think even in small cells is quite a leap. But yes, but there is we're also seeing non-open architectures sort of following the 3-unit disaggregation, just because it makes sense for 5G to have this very real-time unit and then to centralize whatever you can into a centralized unit for greater pooling and scalability. So I think the 3-unit disaggregation is popular and the open front hall interface is popular. Whether we see the entire architecture being deployed by that many operators, I think that's a bit more open to doubt.
Yes, it's interesting. And is Open RAN making much of an impact on the enterprise world, or is it still mostly within the clique of the mobile operator ecosystem? Do the enterprise really care about Open RAN as a concept?
I don't think enterprise cares particularly, but we see more rapid adoption of Open RAN in enterprise than in public networks, despite that clique. As you say, I think in the public networks, even in small cells, most of it is single vendor, traditional vendor Open RAN, whether you're talking macro or small, to be honest. But certainly in the enterprise markets, because they tend to be greenfield cellular networks, they often have non-traditional deployers and often non-traditional vendors. So it's a much more open ecosystem. And if you're starting from scratch and you're not sort of wedded to an industry that you've been in for decades, why wouldn't you go with Open RAN? So it's not that the enterprise are demanding it. They probably, in most cases, don't even know what it is. But if for the deployer, it gives more flexibility, more price choices, more a wider array of different designs, just designs of radio units and so on, that might be enabled by an open ecosystem, then I think there's a big tendency for these enterprise deployers to look very hard at Open RAN, and so it's growing. We see it growing there more quickly than in public, and there are much lower barriers to it.
Okay, let's go on to the final slide and a bit of crystal ball gazing around the
Have to do it.
We've got mandatory. I'm conscious actually there's quite a few questions on this list here. I didn't scroll down the list effectively, so I didn't see how many there were. But so we'll cover this one and then
very quick one on this.
Then some questions.
Yeah, this was just, as you say, a bit of crystal ball gazing. You saw earlier that we asked a question about which technologies would sort of drive small cell deployment in the near term, in the next 3 years. This is looking at plans to invest in technologies in a small cell context, obviously, by 2030. And it's really trying to get a glimpse of which components operators are looking further ahead on. The one that comes out most is 5G standalone, which you could say is certainly not future. It's been with us for some years, but it's only really, for a lot of operators, it still counts as next generation because they haven't done it yet. Same with 5G advanced. But you see, as you go along with some of around AI still up there. So perhaps that's a hype factor, as we talked about earlier. But some of the technologies are very much technologies that are laying foundations for a next generation of the business model, like ultra density, wholesale slicing, sensor networks, particularly sensor and communication convergence. And these are sort of elements of 5G advanced bleeding into whatever 6G may look like in around 2030.
And I guess some of these actually, I'm looking at 5G SA, perhaps also the RAN, AI and edge convergence. You could almost bundle them together in terms of the distribution of IT/edge related infrastructure and whether that is enabling some of these buyers to make decisions around these systems and more advanced capabilities. Is that something you're sensing is a reality?
I am, and we've got some detail in the report about sort of the convergence of edge with network functions. We've talked about it for quite a long time, and again, I think edge compute in a telecom context was overhyped, but now it's really the enterprise in particular is obviously driving a lot of applications out to the edge. And for the deployers, if they are thinking about distributed vRAN, if you can put your network functions and your distributed core on the same piece of infrastructure as the applications, it all becomes much more, it has a much better ROI attached to it, much more functional piece of kit. So yeah, we're starting to see it, and certainly in a few years' time, I would expect this to become the norm in terms of certainly enterprise small cell architectures.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Caroline. I think that's a good. As we've got so many questions, I'm going to move on to just see if I can pick up some of these. Maybe you can see them as well, Caroline. So I don't know if I need to read them out word for word, but maybe I'll just take. There's some people who are highly questioning. I'll try and take a fair share across each of the questioners. Okay, interesting comment from Tony, summarizing to the point. So far, mostly 4G small cells then. Is that the story of the market principally?
Yeah, I think so. I think as we touched on earlier, 4G small cells took a while to mature, but in a way they timed it well. That at the point where they were fully capable, it was just really when particularly this enterprise small cell market was taking off and getting beyond just filling in little gaps. So of course that was great, but it does result in a situation where if you've got a 4G network that's working perfectly well, you have to have a compelling reason to move to 5G, certainly earlier than that 5-6 year enterprise IT cycle that we talked about earlier. So I think there's a big base of 4G, and I think the challenge for the vendors and the deployers now is to try to move those 4G networks on, but that probably is largely a factor of cycles, unless the enterprise's business is changing very much and they need something more sophisticated. So really, in the short term, getting 5G small cells moving, especially in the enterprise, is about finding those customers who haven't done small cells yet and spotting the ones who have a compelling reason to need some of those 5G capabilities, which is where standalone is so important, because it brings, and 5G Advanced, they bring some of those capabilities that could look really different from 4G in a way that early 5G didn't. So we're starting to see it happen, but at the minute, definitely it's a 4G world. It's not till 2027 that we see 5G overtaking.
Excellent. Okay, and thank you to Kendra for your complimentary comments. Flattery will get you everywhere. We'll now treat your question. This is a question generally about the key barriers for the private network operators and the relationship between Wi-Fi. So we could articulate Wi-Fi as a barrier from a small cell perspective, I guess, is what we're saying, isn't it? I mean, it really is what is the tipping point? I mean, this is a perennial discussion that we have in many fora about the Wi-Fi versus small cell. I think we always fall into it's complementary narrative, and I think it's still the case, isn't it? There's enough differentiation in the technologies that you can say that it shouldn't be either or. Enterprises can make use of both in a highly connected enterprise.
I absolutely agree, and I think that's the correct narrative. But I think the word you use there is it shouldn't be. It's like, yes, it should be complementary in an ideal world, of course. But then you've got to find that really, I think, quite small subset of enterprises that believe that it's worth having the cost and complexity of having two networks when they could probably live with one. So to the question, I don't think it's so much that they prefer Wi-Fi; it's that Wi-Fi was there. It does a lot of what's needed, and So there is always a barrier to introducing cellular on top of Wi-Fi. Obviously, there are environments where there isn't any Wi-Fi, or Wi-Fi really doesn't work well. We've seen that in seaports and warehouses and things. But in an awful lot of environments, Wi-Fi is good enough. And so we have to try and look for these enterprises that want to do something quite transformational and therefore need performance that Wi-Fi doesn't provide. But, we have to be realistic that this is a subset of enterprises, and probably most of them ideally would want two networks, but they can't make a terribly good case.
Can't make it work. So this is an interesting question that Paul's picked out here on the UK and whether it's an outlier because of its choice around the shared access licenses. In the UK, about 80% of shared access licenses are on medium power, which could imply outdoors. How does this align with approximately 70% of forecast being for enterprise indoor? Would this make the UK an outlier?
Oh, I see. Yes. Yeah, I think the UK is a big outlier. When we all the data that we collect and forecast, that obviously doesn't all get published because the report would be 500 pages long. But the UK is very different outdoors to most markets. It's probably a bit closer to the United States than other European markets. So I do think it's an outlier, yes.
Yeah, okay. One quick question I'm seeing here. How do you deal with the China market? Does this include China market data?
Yeah. We include China. We split it out from the rest of Asia because otherwise it completely overwhelms Asia and skews the balance. But we have a lot of response from China, from the operators, of course, but also some of the other ecosystem players there. And of course, they've always been extremely active in small cells. So we certainly, despite geopolitics, we certainly wouldn't want to exclude them from the overall forecast.
Are you seeing these questions, Caroline? There's quite a detailed question, but it might be worth just seeing if I can. Somebody's been studying the report and asking about one of the graphs, but one of the verticals that these guys are interested in is targeting real estate and offices. And he's wondering if there's a way to looking through the report to see those sort of verticals are highlighted within the report.
Okay. Well, I could perhaps it might be more easy. It might be better to take that one offline.
Take that offline. I think maybe.
Yeah, because then I can look at the details of the.
Yeah, so it might be Claire. If you're looking at the questions, might be worth just taking that as an offline, and we can.
Yeah, I'm really happy to get back. It's probably a bit detailed for this for our remaining 2 minutes.
That's a good example of a question that we're happy to answer as a forum, quite detailed, but more than happy to pick up those and have a chat.
Absolutely, and I would say any questions that we don't have time to answer.
I'm seeing. I'm just seeing. We've got half a minute left. So I'm seeing if I can find one. Are you seeing any trend towards the split in architectures for indoor and outdoor? In that indoor deployments will be mostly single or 2-box max, or?
Yeah, I mean indoor. Yes, that's right. Unless it's a cloud-hosted small cell. We're seeing these cloud-based options where all your central and SMA functions are on someone's cloud somewhere, and you just have the distributed unit. But from outside of that, then yes, a lot more to split or integrated indoors, and outdoors much quicker movement towards 3 splits and quite complex clusters.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to have to call it time on the questions. We've hit our deadline, so we're going to have to call it a day there. Thank you, Caroline, once again for some very thorough market work. It's very useful, and as the SCF members know very well, we use this data a lot to work on new projects and analysis around white papers and initiatives. So it's always very much appreciated, the quality of work. So thank you, Caroline, for your time.
to do the project and to talk to you, Simon. It's been a really nice conversation.
And there will be future webinars, so everyone please stay tuned to the usual communications from the forum, and we'll be picking up with some other topics that are hot on our list for webinars as we go over the next few months of this year. So thank you everyone for attending, and I'll draw the event to a close now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.